This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. We don't really talk that much about background vocals. In my experience as a singer, it always felt like something that other musicians just sort of assumed you already knew how to do, which, yeah, some people definitely can find good harmony lines by ear, but as with everything else in music, you can get much better results with just a little bit of intentionality, so as one of the few vocalists on Music Theory YouTube, I thought it might be helpful to look at some different approaches you may not have tried before, and since everyone else is doing these 7 levels videos, I figured I probably should too. Before we get started, a couple notes. First, I tried to rank these based on how much they stand out to the listener, which is often correlated with difficulty, but I don't mean to imply that the higher levels are better. Each one serves its own purpose, and each one is worth knowing how to do. Second, for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on adding a single harmony line, but the same principles will apply to larger background sections too. You just do the same thing more times. That can get exponentially harder to do, especially at the higher levels, but the basic principles don't really change. And third, I'm not really going to get into complex harmony notes. That's just a question of reharmonization, which Adam Neely and 8-Bit Music Theory have both already done great videos about, links in the description. What I'm interested in are the arranging techniques of the vocals themselves. And finally, if we're going to do harmony lines, we need a main melody to work with, and while my degree is in vocal performance, I've barely even warmed up in the last 4 years, so instead of subjecting you to what's left of my voice, I'm bringing in a friend who knows a thing or two about harmony vocals, Tim Blais from A Capella Science. Tim does these beautiful a cappella parody covers of pop songs with lyrics explaining scientific concepts like nanobots and entropic time, so if you haven't heard his stuff, I'll link that in the description too, and I highly recommend it. Tim, what have we got?
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Ah, Greensleeves. It's so public domain. Now that we have our melody, let's get right into level 0, background lines.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
These aren't really harmony vocals because they're not connected to the melody, but it's a thing you can do with background singers, so I wanted to include it. In a background line, your singer becomes just another instrument in the band. Here I have Tim singing what are called guide tones, which are the 3rd or 7th of the chord underneath. Or actually, he's just singing the thirds, but in principle you can use either one in a guide tone line. These are the 2 most colorful tones in the chord, so they add a sense of richness and character to the sound, whereas if he'd sung the roots,
alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
it'd sound thicker, but a little bit empty. Don't get me wrong, root lines sound great too, but in progressions where the root isn't just moving by step, guide tones give you more options for smooth voice leading, because you can switch from the 3rd on one chord to the 7th on the next. You can also layer a bunch of these lines starting on different notes to create a choir effect, but I didn't want to make Tim record that many parts. And background lines don't have to be these long-held notes either, they can be anything you might do with a normal instrument. I could have had Tim sing some arpeggios instead.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Or do a cool rhythmic figure, but if we get into all the ways you could possibly write a background line, we're never gonna have time for the actual harmony parts, so let's move on to level 1. Doubling.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
The technique here is simple. You take the melody you're already singing and just sing it again. This can be done at the same pitch like we just heard, or you can shift it up or down an octave.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
For what's appropriately called octave doubling. Doubling is like the minimum level of harmony vocals, and I'm sure some of you don't even think it counts, but I'm including it anyway because it's my video, I make the rules. Besides, doubling's actually really cool, and it can have different effects depending on how it's used. If the 2 voices have a similar tone, or if they're just the same voice, like Tim's, then they blend together, giving you a thicker, fuller version of the same sound. On the other hand, if the voices are different enough, then doubling lets you hear them separately at the same time, giving it like a casual sing-along vibe. This can be ramped up even further by adding more voices, and with enough doubling, you can create the sense of a whole crowd just letting loose without having split up to work out parts beforehand. It's the simplest approach to harmony vocals, but it's still a great one. Slightly more advanced though is level 2, tight harmony.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here's where we start to see actual harmony notes. The idea is to write a new line starting on a different pitch but following the same contour as the main melody, so when the melody moves, the harmony moves in the same direction by about the same amount. This is done by picking an interval, usually a 3rd above or below, and trying to keep your second line that interval away from the melody. So like when Tim is singing B flat here, he's harmonizing it with the G a minor 3rd below. This approach runs into problems sometimes though, like here Tim's singing F and the note a 3rd below that is D, but there's no D in an F major chord, so I had him drop down to C instead. You'll also notice that he varies between major and minor thirds a lot to keep both lines in the same key. This means writing a tight harmony line does require some attention, but if you just bump every wrong note to the nearest chord tone, you won't go wrong. That said, while I wasn't going to spend too much time on fancy notes, this is often a pretty good place to sneak them in if you want to flex a little bit. Check it out.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here I kept that D, using it as what's called a tension, which is an extra note that's not part of the chord but sounds good over it anyway. Over here I used B natural, the major third in a minor tonality, to imply some internal conflict over the word love. Here I used D flat, the flat 7 of the chord, turning it into a dominant 7th to set up the following D chord, and then here I used A sharp, the sharp 5, because I don't have a good reason for that one. Sometimes you just gotta make big decisions and see what happens. Speaking of big decisions, level 3, oblique harmony.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here the line just sits still. It's kinda like our background line from before, but with the rhythm and lyrics of the melody so you hear it as more connected. Oblique harmony creates an anchoring effect. One voice is moving a lot while the other stays put, adding a sense of restraint to your otherwise free-flowing melody. As you might imagine, it's not that hard to write, but there are a couple variations. I was doing chord tone harmony, where the line moves when the chord does, usually sticking to the root, although guide tones are an option as well, but if you really want to commit, you can do pedal harmony.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Where you just do one note the whole time. Or, okay, I dropped a F sharp on the last chord because G does not sound good over D major, but you get the point. Honestly, this is probably my favorite demo in the whole video. Oblique harmony is gorgeous and more people should use it. But if you must do something more complicated, you might want to try level 4, emphatic harmony.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here, the line is only popping up occasionally to emphasize specific moments. Now, you can do this based on musical moments. I could have had Tim harmonize, say, the first 2 notes of each line.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
But I feel like that's a waste of emphatic harmony's potential. No, what makes this level interesting is its ability to step outside of traditional musical concerns like notes, chords, and bars and engage with one of the most important elements of vocal music, the lyrics. What is the song saying, and which words play the biggest role in delivering that message? Greensleeves is about getting in your feelings about being rejected, so I keyed in on the words alas, wrong, and discourteously. These words are carrying the narrative weight of the line, so stripping out all the other harmonies and just shining a spotlight on them helps drive that point home. Plus, they're scattered in different parts of the bar, so punctuating them helps add another rhythmic layer to this otherwise pretty repetitive melody. And if we're adding rhythmic layers, then we have to talk about level 5, heterophony.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Okay, now things are getting weird. Heterophony is when you have multiple voices singing the same melody, but each of them is embellishing it differently. Like doubling, this can create a sense that you have a group of people just like hanging out and singing songs, but with heterophony, it's less rigid and more involved. It's not just one melody anymore, everyone's bringing their own thing to the table. So how do you write it? Well, you usually don't. I mean, I did for this video, but a lot of the time heterophonic parts are improvised. You give everyone the melody and just let them play around with it however they want. This does require trusting your background singer, but in my experience, background singers tend to be twice the musician their lead is anyway, so they'll probably be fine. You can also combine heterophony with other levels like tight harmony for even more interesting sounds. Real heterophony is pretty rare in Western popular music, showing up more in the traditional music of cultures like Thailand, India, the Balkans, and Ghana, but it does appear sometimes in jazz and soul music as well. From there, we move on to level 6, counterpoint.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here, we're effectively writing a whole new melody with a completely different contour, and if that sounds tricky, good news. It is. Okay, that's not good news, but hey, if music was easy, everyone would do it. If you want to sound like, say, Jacob Collier or whatever flashy vocal arranger you prefer, understanding how to write a good counterline is essential. So what makes a good counterline? Well, the ultimate test is whether or not it can stand on its own. Many of our previous levels produce melodies that are just slightly worse versions of the lead, but if I play my counterline,
alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
That's a strong melody all by itself, and it sounds nothing like the main one. But how do you do that? There's a lot of tricks to counterpoint, but my best tip is to try to use contrary motion as much as possible. If the lead goes up, your counterline should go down, and vice versa. Of course, if you do that mechanically, it's gonna sound mechanical, so this should be treated more as a guideline than a rule, and I didn't follow it strictly in my example either, it's just a good starting point. When you do move your lines in the same direction though, you have to be extra careful or else you might run into the dreaded parallelism. Now what I'm about to describe is often taught as like a rule of music, so just to be clear, it's not. Those don't exist. But it is a helpful guideline when you're working with complex harmony parts. Basically, if your two voices move the same distance in the same direction, they kinda blend together momentarily into a single line. This is the principle behind tight harmony and it works great there, but now we really want our counterline to stand out, so that blending becomes a bad thing. This is especially noticeable if those voices are a particularly consonant interval apart, like a perfect fifth or an octave. In those cases, moving in parallel means you completely lose that sense of independence, so if you ever find your counterline a fifth or octave away from the lead, make sure you use contrary motion to get out, or if you really need to go in the same direction, do it by a different interval. This isn't particularly hard when you're just working with two voices like I was, but the more you add, the trickier it gets, because not only do you have to manage the motion between your counterline and your lead, you also have to watch out for parallels between different counterlines. Adding more lines also means you can't just always use contrary motion because there's only so many ways a melody can move, so you have to be careful about which lines are moving together at any given moment. It's not the end of the world if you get a couple parallels, but the more you can avoid it, especially on those strong consonant intervals, the richer and more complex your harmonies will sound. There's also a couple other official rules of counterpoint, like for instance your lines aren't supposed to cross, so if you start below the lead you should stay there, but I didn't do that in my example and you don't have to either. Rules are for suckers. As long as you're keeping track of the interactions between your lead and your counterline, you can pretty much do whatever you want, which brings us to level 7, complete independence.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Here we've just thrown the original melody out the window. It's different notes, different rhythms, the only thing it holds on to is the lyrics. At this point, we don't really have to worry about parallels anymore because if we're not moving at the same time, our lines won't blend, but in exchange, we have to decide on a whole new kind of phrasing. The approach I used was to look for gaps in the melody that the new line could fill. When the lead is busy, the counterline makes space for it, but when the lead is resting, you've got room to shine. You can also combine this with the emphatic harmony approach, taking a particularly important lyric and splitting it out into an independent melodic line to really drive it home.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Or you could take the first few words and slow it all down into something resembling the background lines at the start.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
But once you're singing different lyrics at the same time, especially if you're holding them for a while, you need to watch out for vowel blending. Different vowels have different sounds, and if the vocal tones are similar enough, your ear will try and combine them into one phoneme and then get mad when it doesn't work. This isn't a huge deal if the tone is relatively clean like Tim's, but as a metal singer myself, let me tell you, if you got any sort of roughness or distortion in the voice, the additional complexity of a blended vowel can make things pretty hard to listen to. Honestly, you can still hear it a bit even in Tim's voice, especially when the two vowels are close but not identical, like in love and wrong, so if I was tasked with arranging this for a real song, I'd probably want to have the second line sung by someone with a noticeably different tone to help separate it out in my listener's head, but that'd require finding a second singer, and who has time for that? Actually, let's talk about adding extra singers, because at this level, it gets really hard to do. Most of the time, if you already have an independent harmony line and you want to add another voice, the best thing to do is going to be to write that voice in at a lower level, so you could have, say, one lead vocalist singing the main melody, and then 3 background singers doing the same independent line in tight harmony. You can also employ this technique in reverse, giving the background singers the melody while your actual lead goes and ad-libs an independent line. It's a great way to ramp things up in like a final chorus or whatever, bringing in new musical elements to a section your listener is already familiar with. And finally, we come to the bonus level, the second lead.
Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
That's right, there's a level 0 and a bonus level, which means this is secretly 9 levels of vocal harmony. You're welcome. Where before we were trying to fill gaps and accent the main melody, here we don't care. We've got a whole second melody that's just doing its own thing. Much like with background lines, it's unclear whether this is actually a harmony vocal at all, and honestly, once you're at this point, it's probably better to just write the two parts together instead of trying to fit one to the other, but it's a thing that happens, so I thought it was worth including. In most songs with this technique, you'll also see portions with other lower level approaches like tight harmony and counterpoint, where one of the singers temporarily establishes themselves as the real lead while the other follows along or even just sits out for a bit, and a common approach to double lead writing is to have each singer take a melody from one of the parts where they were in charge and just sing both of them together. This sometimes leads to clashes with the harmony, like in the second bar, Scarborough Fair resolves back to G while Greensleeves is clearly spelling out an F chord, but as long as the clashes are small, the novelty of the second melody can help cover them up. Again, this puts you at risk of vowel blending, so it still helps to have different sounding singers, but when the lines are this distinct, you can kind of get away with it a bit more. The context makes it clear that you're not supposed to be combining the two parts. So how can you use all this in your own writing? Well, that depends what you're trying to do. If you're a lead vocalist, you might want to look for ways to make space for these techniques in your melodies. If you're a background singer, see if you can find opportunities to try out different levels in support of your lead. And if you're not a singer at all, but you write vocal arrangements anyway, maybe try adding in some extra levels to see if you like the sound. Sure, it's easy to just always write tight harmonies, but sometimes there's a better option out there if you're just willing to do the experiment. But even the best harmony lines in the world won't sound good unless they're mixed right, so if you want to learn how to do that, you should really check out Skillshare. They've got some amazing classes on audio engineering, including one called Audio Mixing on the Go, where professional sound engineer King Arthur teaches you how to get a great mix without needing a whole studio's worth of gear. It's a great class, breaking down the elements of a good mix and walking you through the process of making one yourself. If you want to check that out, or if you're interested in any of Skillshare's thousands of other courses on singing, songwriting, and even important non-musical skills like marketing, productivity, and graphic design, then you should probably click the link in the description, because the first 1,000 people to do that get free premium access to Skillshare's entire library for 2 full months, and if you like what you see, sticking around is super affordable with premium plans starting under $10 a month. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Duck and Howard Levine. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.